Hi everybody, it's Dan.
And Ashley.
And we're here at the banks of the Yough. What are we about to see?
First of all, setting the scene, we are 1700s here at the Yough River, going to see a young, spry, handsome George Washington.
With brown hair, not gray hair.
A young George Washington float on a handmade raft on this river for historic purposes. I'm so excited.
It's going to be so cool. The folks here up at Yough River, they have done a great job. We just sat through a 40-minute long presentation about the history of George Washington and his group kind of going on into the confluence, and it was about 40 minutes. We're going to show some highlights of that as well. It was great. The folks from Ohio Pile have done such a great job getting this thing together. So we're going to head down and we'll get to show you what we're about to see.
So my name is George Washington, and that's pretty much where I'll end speaking in the first person. So I'm going to give you the story of what George's adventure was through this particular area, leading up to it, during, and a little bit of the historical context of why that was important for what he did. But I tried in the mirror a little bit to do first person interpretation, and trust me, you don't want that. So you're going to get the story in third person. But to do that, you see this lovely map in front of us. And this map, you may see some things you recognize on here, but it's not really showing you the current landmarks that you would see today. But what you do see are some of the natural landmarks that haven't moved, like lakes and rivers, and also some other color shading. So what's going on here? Well, you see some red territory over here, you see some blue territory over here, and a swath down the middle of territory that is sheet colored. And so what do those three, does anybody want to tell me what they think this red territory represents over here?
British territory.
Bingo! So this is British claimed territory, and during this time, so we're traveling back to about mid-1700s. So when we get to the river here, we'll be in 1754, but I'm going to give you a little context, sort of late 1740s into early 1750s, about what this all looked like. So at the time, the British were sort of moving east to west and numbered in the approximate territory of about 1.2 million British. And what are the British trying to do in this general context of this area? Sort of, but not quite. Yes. He said they're trying to drive the French out. So do you think that's what this blue represents over here? Okay. And what about this middle swath? So if they're trying to drive the French out, you could call this area in the middle contested territory, or neutral ground maybe, but it's not going to become very neutral. They're going to both jockey for position. But the aims of the British and the French in this area, which this was the western frontier at this time, and so the aims are very different. The British are trying to basically colonize. They want to set up towns and villages and trade and farming, and they're encouraging people to do that. The French, on the other hand, who number roughly 70,000, which is far fewer than 1.2 million, are primarily using this territory as kind of a means of getting and trading goods. So there's a lot of fur trapping going on, trading with native people that are here and living and have things like a lot of beaver pelts that they can trade for French goods for. So that also leads me to the third group of people that are in this area, and they're not represented by either of these colors, but they're throughout this whole territory to some extent. Who might that be? Yes, so we have three main Native American groups that are here at that time, and she is showing you the flags of those people. So we have the Iroquois Confederacy, which, if I can see through that, is the bottom flag. We also, and the primary group for the Iroquois Confederacy was the Seneca tribe. They were known as the keepers of the western door. They were the ones that were primarily in this area. The rest of the Iroquois Confederacy was more up into the New York area of the United States. The other folks that were here are the Lenape, also known as the Delaware. That's their representation, and the Shawnee. And the Shawnee and the Lenape were, prior to 1750, further east from here, but they had been displaced by this red wave moving across the state of Pennsylvania, and primarily from the walking purchase. And there's a whole program that you could do on the walking purchase, but that was how those tribes and the Seneca kind of all ended up in this area, and then also over into the Ohio country, a little bit further to the west. So those are our main players, and those are the people who are kind of trying to figure out maybe how to coexist, but also asserting their form of what they want this area of the United States to look like. And the aim of those native tribes was primarily just to try to live how they had been for the last 10 to 16,000 years that they had been living here in the United States prior to it being the United States. So that sets the stage of who the people were here in this time. And we're going to start our story at a little trading area known as Logstown. And Logstown is on the Ohio River, just north and west of present-day Pittsburgh. And Logstown was a very important trading outpost in this sort of contested neutral area between British and French claimed territory. And at this town, there were two gentlemen primarily that were stationed there, one by the name of Scaruity and another by the name of Tanagrishan, or as the English called him, the Half King. There was also a gentleman known as Christopher Gist. That's not actually his picture, that's just a random picture from the internet. But Christopher Gist was the representative from the Ohio Company. So he was representing British interests in the area. And this was a place where they had this grand meeting in 1752. And from that meeting, everybody is kind of expressing their interests, their needs. The British are basically promising, like, hey, if you let us do our thing down over here, like we'll leave you alone over here. And actually, we'll probably go beyond that and help, keep the French where they need to be. So promises are starting to be made here. So Queen Aliquippa asks them to build a fort to sort of assert this claim and this sort of British influence in the area right at the forks of the Ohio, which is present-day Pittsburgh. So there are two other gentlemen that I'd like to introduce you to, one of which hired Christopher Gist to be in this area as a representative for the Ohio Company, and his name is Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia. And so he's representing British claims, and Governor Dinwiddie is basically calling all the shots. So all of the things that happen from here on out that we're going to talk about, he's basically trying to make those things happen on the British end of things. On the other side of things is a gentleman who is the governor of the province of Canada, and he's representing French claims, and this gentleman is known as Duquesne. And Duquesne is seeing this kind of influence coming up from Virginia and responds by building a series of French forts. And so they have kind of this claim territory up from Canada all the way down to Louisiana near New Orleans. And so he decides to build a series of forts to try to encroach a little bit into that contested territory towards the forks of the Ohio. So he builds Fort Presque Isle. Has anybody been there? Up on Lake Erie. Then he builds another fort just to the south of that, known as Fort LaBeouf. And then a third fort a little bit south of that, known as Fort Michaud. So these are the French fortifications to sort of, this becomes sort of a, but look at what we have kind of thing. And they're just doing this back and forth. So fast forward a little bit to 1753, after these forts are some under construction and some already in place. And Governor Dinwiddie responds by hiring this young, ambitious, very handsome looking 21-year-old George Washington. And George Washington is really, he's this up and coming, ambitious guy wanting to make a name for himself. So Gist asks him to deliver a message to the French. And George is not like the foremost expert out here, but if you remember a man from Logstown known as Christopher Gist, he knows how to speak French. He also knows a little native tongue. He has some connections there as well. So he's hired by Washington as his guide. They travel up and end up in Logstown, back in Logstown. Have another meeting with the Native Americans that are there, Half King and Screwity, and basically are telling them what their plans are. And as you can imagine, word travels fast. The French kind of find out that these gentlemen are in the area, so they know that they're coming. But George and Gist continue traveling up and eventually reach Fort Michaud. And at Fort Michaud, they kind of present this message, but then are told to continue on to Fort LeBoeuf, where they deliver the message of, hey, you guys basically need to you got to get out of here. This is going to all be British. You need to get out of here. What do you think they said? What do you think the French said? No. You in what army, buddy? So George had his answer that then he had to take back to Governor Dinwiddie.
Did I miss the change?
No, not yet. So
I'm not really paying attention.
that's okay. She's being a very good Vanna White, though. So George has this message of no, we're not going to get out by the French, that he has to take back then to Virginia to let Governor Dinwiddie know what the French intentions are. So there's a little side story here. This is the Allegheny River. George and Christopher Gist, as they're traveling back towards Virginia, are fired on and sort of pursued by Native Americans. And they get to the banks of the Allegheny River, and in this hot pursuit, according to George, build this raft out of haste to cross the river, which we're talking December of 1753. There's ice chunks floating in the river, and this is their way of escaping Indian pursuit, Native American pursuit. So they build this raft. It does not go very well. Maybe it's a hasty raft that was not really strung together very well. However you slice it, Washington falls off and finds himself in the river. Gist, being the hero that he is, saves Washington back onto the raft. My hero. They spend a very cold night together on an island, and it, according to Washington, was so cold that night that the river froze the rest of the way across, and in the morning they were able to continue on to the far bank by walking across the ice to get to the far shore. Wild, right? So all we have to go on is Washington's word here. It's a pretty, remember, this guy's trying to make a name for himself. These are pretty heroic stories. What's that?
I cannot tell a lie.
That's true, but that story was also kind of made up. But we love our George Washington for many reasons. But just keep in mind, he's trying to make a name for himself. So these frontier stories are like how he ends up getting promoted. So he makes his way all the way back to Virginia, and Governor Dinwiddie, even though he gave him a bad message, said, thank you, there was a long trip during the winter. It was a really hard thing to do. I'm going to make you Lieutenant Colonel Washington. So he gets this nice raise, I don't know if it came with a financial raise, but people were really concerned about sort of moving up in the ranks. And he successfully did that. Did George then get to go on vacation? No. He's got to go back. So Dinwiddie is like, all right, well, I guess we'll send some men with you to force them out of this territory. So he assigns 150 Virginia militia to George Washington, and they start making their way back up to get the French out of here. This is still Fort Trent, and as they're coming up, unfortunately, Washington gets word that Duquesne has sent an army of 400 or 500 men, and there's only like 40 people at Fort Trent trying to build this fort. You can imagine 40 people seeing 400 French coming, and they said, "Oh, hey, we were just leaving. You can have this area. We didn't really want it anyway." So the French start to build their own fort, Fort Duquesne. But Washington, he's got this 150 men. He thinks, well, I can still continue on, make it to that French fort, and at least try to get the French to hear some reason or be intimidated by me and my 150 militia. He is also told that he's going to continue to get reinforcements. So there's hope that he'll have some weight to his, boasting to the French. So as he's going up, he's also building roads. So we're now, think about Cumberland, Maryland, which was at the time a place known as Wills Creek, eventually becomes Fort Cumberland, is that purple dot below Ohiopyle. So Washington and his men are making their way towards, and again, think about Route 40. That was the old Nemacolin's path. He's using that path and trying to build a wider road to get all the way back to the forks of the Ohio in present-day Pittsburgh. When he gets to the banks of the Yough River, at a place that was known at the time as the Great Crossing. And this Great Crossing is basically where 40 goes over Yough Lake, is where trade tends to travel over the river. But when he gets there, the river is pretty flooded and too high. So it's not safe for his men to ford. So they make camp, and now we're talking May 20th, 1754. So 1753 in December is when he made his way back. Now it's spring of 1754, May 20th. He's at the banks of the Yough River, and he decides, man, this road building stuff is really tough. This is pretty thick country. It's really slow going. But we're on this river here.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, how patriotic. Like we planned that. So George has this idea that they could use the Yough River as a supply route. He knew kind of the direction that it went to get to the forks of the Ohio a much easier way. I can just put cannons on these wide drift boats. We can get to the forks of the Ohio really easily this way, and I can abandon all this road building nonsense. So he takes a small scouting party of 6 people and hires a Native American guide. Well, the Native American guide is included in that 6. So it's George, 4 other people from his militia, and 1 Native American guide, all in this one canoe. And their goal is to kind of scout the Yough River to see how viable this could be as a supply route and a road towards the forks of the Ohio. So what he soon learns is that 6 people and all their gear is too much for 1 canoe. They're having a hard time. They're getting stuck on rocks. A lot of the time, probably the lowest person on the totem pole is out pulling the canoe through rocks. And eventually they see this gentleman on the side of the river who is a French, well, actually, I don't know that he was French. His name was Peter Shaver, or Chavier. So he was this French Navy trapper that was in the area that basically hails them in and says, hey guys, I don't know if you know, but it doesn't get any easier from here. He's kind of providing this warning of like what's to come. And George says, thank you, but I'm going to try anyway. Why not? What have I got to lose? His Native American guide also, it seems like, knows the dangers that lie ahead also, because he eventually sort of raises his price for guiding to continue going, because I think he knows what's coming. But George doesn't really do a great job at writing all that down. But we know that so the Native American guide asks for a match coat, which is kind of this almost like cape thing that's used especially to keep you from getting wet or cold, and a ruffled shirt. Hard to get those ruffled shirts back then. So this Native American guide was providing, he was the first river guide, I guess, and I guess George was the first paying customer because he gave him, the shirt and the match coat to go on down the river. But to keep going, George says, I think I need to build a second boat. And so they're probably a little ways upstream from here, and they pull in and they decide it takes a long time to build a canoe, but you could string together a raft with hemp rope and maybe some vines to make a second boat relatively quickly, to sort of disperse the weight and the people so that they're all not trying to go in this one canoe. So they successfully build this boat, which we have a replica of today, which was mentioned that we're going to float down, hopefully, from here to reenact and recreate this journey. So he then proceeds on with the canoe and the log raft till they get to just downstream from here, which they noticed another river coming in from the right, which today is known as the Castleman River. And they pull in, and George decides to scout the area and make camp there for the night. So George writes in his journal, this looks like a great place for a possible future fortification. There's 3 streams that come together that kind of look like a turkey's foot. So that's sort of the nickname. If you're familiar with that area, the Turkey's Foot, there's the Laurel Hill Creek, the Castleman River, and the Yough River all come together to make that confluence there that looks like a turkey's foot. So next day, the 21st, they continue on downstream, and this is where it starts to get interesting. So has anybody ever paddled the middle Yough River? Starts out pretty chill, pretty calm. There are a few rapids here and there, so things are starting to get a little bit interesting. But then as you approach Ohiopyle, things start to get even more interesting, and there are some relatively significant rapids if you're traveling in a wooden canoe and a log raft. So George has this experience that he journals about where his log raft gets pinned between a couple of rocks, and he is ejected from that boat, finds himself in the river, but his trusty companions pull him back in and save him from these tumultuous rapids. Again, remember, we're trying to make this seem like as impressive as possible. So he gets to shore, and then now they're at about the point of Ohiopyle Falls. And Ohiopyle Falls, you definitely can't take a log raft over, and he notes that in his journal, and he actually estimates that the falls is about 40 feet perpendicular. Which we now know today that it's just shy of 20 feet, so a little bit more exaggeration. But the river here is impassable by log raft. So George's famous quote from this moment is that this river will never be made navigable, which I laugh at every time I watch kayakers go over Ohiopyle Falls. What would George have thought of this ridiculousness? So from there, they abandon their plan to go to the forks of the Ohio on the Yough River. So George goes and meets back up with the rest of his militia at a place known as the Great Meadows. And the Great Meadows looks to George to be a nice place for kind of a fortification. You can graze your animals here. It's clear, so you can see enemy approaching. And while he's there, he receives word from the Half King, Mr. Tanagrishan, that there's an encampment of French, approximately 35 of them, a few miles away in a rocky outcropping. And so George takes 40 of his own militiamen, and he goes to confront these men at a place we now know as Jumonville Glen. And this area is where Jumonville and his men were camped, and George surrounds them at the high ground. And again, there's a little bit of debate about what happened from here. But likely George and his men attacked the French in this glen, and they killed or captured everyone. So, except for one Frenchman, who, where do you think that Frenchman went? He went back to Fort Duquesne to tell the French what had just happened. And the French claimed that they were there on a diplomatic mission, just to kind of interact with the British. But this is also the site where Tanagrishan, who was allied with the British, got to enact some revenge on Jumonville, who represented to him the French, who Tanagrishan's father had been killed by the French, and Tanagrishan kind of held this grudge ever since then. So he scalped Jumonville, and all of this did not go very well with the French. And I think Washington kind of had realized maybe what was about to happen, what he did. So he makes his way back to the Great Meadows and builds a fort out of necessity, because he knows that the French are probably going to be regrouping and maybe trying to retaliate from this attack on the French diplomatic party. So, has anybody been to Fort Necessity? Yes. It is a fort out of necessity, right? It's some sticks in a circle with a shed in the middle and a little bit of a mound around the outside. So Washington is there building this fortification, kind of waiting for this impending approach of the French. And he's also hoping for fortification and reinforcements from Virginia. And eventually he does get to about 400 at Fort Necessity. He's hoping for more. Right? There's more coming. But the French are coming too. And on July 3rd, the French kind of, if you've seen Fort Necessity, they approach the fort, but they stay kind of back in the tree line, which unfortunately for George and his men is just within range of the tree line. So fire's coming from the tree line, but fire return is not super successful because they're hiding behind trees. And it's pouring rain, and gunpowder, and these flintlock rifles are really hard to operate in the rain. So the French give George an opportunity to surrender, which eventually he takes. He signs what's known as the Articles of Capitulation, which, remember, George doesn't speak French. He has a Dutchman there with him that does speak some French, and roughly translate this document that's also kind of wet and rain-soaked. And what it basically says is that George Washington is admitting to the assassination of Jumonville, and he is also saying that basically this is his fault. That was his fault, but with that, he is allowed to retreat back to Virginia with sort of military honors. So this is not like this humiliating thing, although this was George's only ever military surrender. And so George's career got off to kind of a rough start from all of this. But it didn't matter in the end. He definitely, things worked out for his career, I should say, anyway. So, after Fort Necessity, George goes back to Virginia, again, kind of with his tail between his legs, and reports back to Governor Dinwiddie. So, Dinwiddie is pretty resolute to return again and continue this back and forth with the French, which, if you see, the French are kind of winning at this point, right? So he sends back a man known as General Braddock, which I don't remember if I got General Braddock's picture, maybe. And George is under the command now of General Braddock. So General Braddock is marching back with a total of about 2,400 troops. So things are escalating. There's a lot more people that are involved in this conflict now, and is traveling back that same road which Washington and his men built the year prior, actually 2 years prior. This is 1755 now. And so he gets to the point where he actually is moving slow. There's a lot of people, 2,400 soldiers. So he ends up splitting his army. So the slow folks that are carrying all the camp gear and everything go in behind, and he sends an advance party of about 1,300. So they're getting really close to Fort Duquesne, and the French come out to confront General Braddock. Now, let me also say that General Braddock had his way of doing things, and one of those things was that he wasn't willing to work with any Native Americans. When he parlayed with Native Americans, he is famously quoted as saying, when the Native Americans asked them, well, when we help you, like, what's to come of us? General Braddock responds by saying, no savage shall ever inherit this land. So if somebody says that to you, are you inclined to fight for them? No. And that was this man, Shingas. So he loses all his Native American support. The French still have a good deal of Native American support. And so when the French, I'm going to get the numbers right here, there's only 254 French and 637 Native Americans. So when they confront this advance party of General Braddock's army, again, General Braddock is a man of tradition. He's going to stand and fight in rows like good British gentlemen. But the French and the Native Americans are doing this sort of new form of warfare where they're using trees as cover. And it's really, really, really damaging to General Braddock's troops. He eventually ends up losing about 2/3 of his troops. He is mortally wounded, and there is even suspicion or rumor that he was eventually shot down by his own men because he was refusing to let them fight in the way that the French and the Indians were fighting. And he was even recorded as cutting down his own men that were abandoning the formations and the lines to fight in that way. So pretty brutal guy, knew what he wanted and how he wanted to get it, but in this case, it did not work out in General Braddock's favor. So again, the French are looking pretty good here. This board kind of stays the way that it does. However, I'm going to kind of fast forward through time because we want to launch this rap. We're getting excited, and I talk way too long. But this is basically the foundation of a war that became known as the French and Indian War. But we also like to say that this was really the First World War. This went back and was fought on the British and French homeland. It involved other nations. It was eventually fought on 4 different continents and lasted 7 years. So this was a big, long, excruciating battle that eventually this stuff here really didn't matter anymore. Because all the fighting that was happening in Europe, the French, basically their attitude towards this now was when the French that were in the colonies then were asking for aid and assistance, were basically like, why would we tend to the barn when our house is on fire? So essentially, we've got bigger problems over there, and this is really not our high priority. So these French that were here were kind of left and were on their own. And again, you all probably can guess the result of this, right? We don't speak French today. The British eventually overtake these areas. And if you want to know more about this, you can go to Fort Ligonier. There's way more to this story, and find out exactly how all of that happened. By the time they took over Fort Duquesne, there wasn't that much left of Fort Duquesne. The French are just kind of spread way too thin, and again, all the supplies and effort is being focused in France. And so eventually, if we had an animated map here, we could redraw this with the red. The red wave was coming across the rest of Pennsylvania and into the Ohio country. So what's the result of this? And why is the river here kind of an important part of this? So that all kind of started because George couldn't keep going on the river and ended up at the Great Meadows and interacting at Jumonville Glen. What would have happened if George just could have kept going all the way to Pittsburgh? We don't really know. We could guess maybe he would have been successful at getting the French out of Fort Duquesne, and maybe there wouldn't have been this 7-year-long war. So why this is really important is that from that big war, Britain had massive debt. It costs a lot of money to go to war. And their way, one of their ways of increasing and recouping that revenue was taxes on the new colonies. And so the people that were here didn't really love that. And you may want to revolt or create a revolution if that's going on. So as we celebrate the 250th, you can kind of now have this context of how this immediate area and this river played into that larger picture of how we became a nation, and here we are 250 years later talking about it. But I also like to remember that, you know, the French are fine. Like, they lost this ability to trade and have their stuff. They still had a country. You know, they're still Quebec. You know, I love the French, but like they still got their country over there. I mean, we don't have to feel bad for the British, although, you know, they did lose to the colonists and George a little bit later on. But what gets kind of lost in the shuffle here is that there, for 10 to 16,000 years, there were people that lived here, and they were trying to just hunt and fish and live and raise kids and do their thing. And this area kept growing and growing and growing, and the people of the Seneca and the Greater Iroquois Confederacy and the Lenape and the Shawnee got basically moved to small areas or reservations. So, you know, no matter what side they picked or who they fought for, the promises, they were kind of pawns in the chess game. And so, to me, they were the ultimate tragedy of this story. But moving on from that, because we are ridiculous and work at Ohio Pile, I've had this dream to float George's historical path on a log raft. We built a log raft, and we'd really like you all to help us launch it and kiss us goodbye as we go out to this. Who knows what's going to happen to us? We're going to try to float all the way to Ohio Pile.
We wanted to add that the folks at Ohio Pile put together a documentary, or are putting together a documentary.
And you'll be able to watch it on Fayette TV, on the YouTube channel, and on actual stations, Channel 77.
Yeah, they're working on it right now. It's going to be really neat. It was a big process trying to get a raft big enough to fit these folks on it. And so about a year ago, they built one just to try to see what it would look like, and they put together the history of what we just saw as well. So it's going to be great. We'll keep everyone updated on when that comes out. That's going to come out from Ohio Pile, and they're planning on doing a premiere up at Ohio Pile as well. So we're en route. Ashley, what did we just see?
You can still see behind us George Washington literally on a raft with a safety team for today's day and age, but back then he didn't have it. It's amazing. It's incredible. You can feel the energy here, and you can see it happening. I'm humbled to be here. George, we got to meet George Washington.
I mean, there wouldn't be a more perfect day for this. I mean, it's a little rainy, it's a little wet and damp, but I mean, it's what it would have been back then. So, you know, come rain or shine, he's going down the river regardless. So it's been pretty cool to be here.
Fayette County knows how to celebrate the semi-quincentennial here for America's 250th.
It's only going to get better from here.